Now that we have the walls up on our 12x16 shed, we're ready to start framing the roof. To make things extra complicated for ourselves, we're going to be building a vaulted or cathedral ceiling to maximize usable storage space inside the shed, so we will need to install a structural ridge beam. A traditional roof, which utilizes rafter ties or ceiling joists, spreads the load of the roof along these ties, thereby eliminating the need for a structural beam, and can be built with a non-structural ridge board instead. The beam will be resting on this 4x4 post. Based on the dimensions of our shed and hours of research, we decided to go with a 2-ply LVL beam, which means we'll be joining together two separate beams to make one beefy beam that measures 3.5 inches deep by 9.5 inches wide and spans the full 16 feet of the shed's length. In order to save our backs, we lifted them into place one at a time and then screwed them together once in place. With the beam in place, we decided to sheathe the walls first before installing the rafters in order to ensure the roof rafters land snugly on the sheathed building. We used zip sheathing for this project because it is essentially OSB sheathing with a water-resistant barrier baked in. This eliminates the need for any house wrap, saving us a step and speeding up the process. We also wanted to maintain as tight of an envelope as possible in an effort to control the climate to the best of our abilities, in order to protect the stuff we'll be storing in the shed. The zip system creates a nice tight seal around the whole structure, which should help support our insulation efforts and also prevent against bugs entering the building. In order to make assembling easier, we added a block on the top plate and one on the side of the wall so that the panel can easily slip into place squarely without having to futz with it much. Another nice advantage of the zip system is that the nail holes are all marked, so as long as you did your stud layout correctly, you'll know exactly where you should be nailing to secure it in place. The panels also come with a small protrusion included on one end that acts as a sort of built-in spacer, so you don't need to worry about manually adding expansion gaps between panels. I used my router with a flush trim bit to cut out the openings. While Aaron was nailing the panels, I was inside the shed checking to see that the nails land properly in the studs, and somehow I ended up falling from the top of the ladder down to the shed floor, somewhere around here, resulting in a hairline fracture and some pretty nasty bruises. So be careful when you're on a ladder. It's easy to take climbing up and down for granted when you're doing it often, but it is potentially dangerous. Now that the walls are sheathed, we can start making the rafters. Our roof is going to have a 4/12 pitch. All that means is for every 12 inches of run, the roof rises 4 inches. Fully understanding roof pitch gets complicated, but I'll leave a link to some videos we found helpful in the description. The first step is to cut the end of the board that will attach to the ridge beam. Luckily, our miter saw has markings for roof pitch, but you can also just Google what the angle of a certain roof pitch is and set your saw accordingly. In our case, it's around 18 degrees. The part of the rafter that sits on the top plate is called a Birdsmouth Cut because it looks like a bird's beak. This is where it gets a little tricky, and I'll try my best to explain our process, but we're no experts. Most speed squares will have roof pitch markings on them. Once you know where the heel of the cut should land, you can mark that point on your board and pivot your speed square to the correct pitch of your roof. In our case, I lined up the edge with the 4 mark since our roof has a 412 pitch. If angles make more sense to you, you can also use an angle finder to mark this line, following the angle of the first cut you made in the board, since the heel of the bird's mouth will be at the same angle as the start of the rafter. Then I just marked the depth of the bird's mouth and drew a line that is perfectly perpendicular or 90 degrees from the heel of the bird's mouth to the edge of the board. There are many handy formulas and tips out there to help figure out your bird's mouth cut, but I spent the time before starting the build to design this 3D model in SketchUp so I could figure out all of my measurements at the comfort of my desk beforehand. Good news, once you have one rafter cut, you can use it as a template to mark the others, which really speeds things up. To attach the bird's mouth to the top plate, we use these headlock 6-inch screws. We had to come back to finish sheathing the last of the walls in order to give my injuries some time to heal. This one was a fun one because of all the weird shapes in the gable. It was kind of like a very large puzzle, but this wasn't our first time working with weird shapes, and our drywall experience definitely came in handy. Now we're ready to fill in the gaps created by the rafters at the top of the wall. Our 1906 house has some beautiful exposed rafter tails that feels quintessentially craftsman, and we wanted to repeat that look on the shed, but having the rafter tails protrude past the sheathing did add a bit of complication to our plan to create a tightly sealed structure. These added blocks and some caulk around where the rafter tails meet the paneling was our solution. Once that was done, we could tape the seams. And finally, it was time to cut the rafters to length. Since we want a 1-foot overhang, we just measured a foot across on the first and last rafter and drew a line down at the same angle as the pitch of the roof so that the rafter tails will be perpendicular to the ground. Then we used a chalk line to mark the other rafters in between. The exposed end grain of the rafters are highly susceptible to soaking up moisture, and since they are at the edge of the roof, they will be exposed to water regularly. In order to try and protect them, I layered on a nice thick coat of wood glue. It should act as an extra barrier, sealing the porous ends of the wood before applying paint. At least that's what I think it'll do, but only time will tell. In order to create the overhang at the front and back of the shed, we added a couple of 2x4s running across the roof framing to hold the gable rafters in place. It took some time to create the notches for the 2x4 to pass through, but luckily it was only a handful per wall. Now that all the framing is finally done, we're going to try to put on a roof ourselves. Please hit that like button if you enjoyed watching, and if you want to see a couple of completely inexperienced DIYers tackle roofing, subscribe to our channel so you can catch our next upload.